You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're joined again by author John Glatt here to talk to us about his new book, Tangled Vines, Power, Privilege, and the Murdaugh Family Murders. John, thank you for joining us again on Mind Over Murder.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Tell us about what you've been up to since the last time we talked to you. We had you on to talk about the Doomsday Mother, which we loved. And actually, I think I love Tangled Vines a lot more. But talk to us a little bit about what you've been doing since then.
Actually, after the Doomsday Mother, I threw myself right into Tangled Vines, the best part of 2 years. And I don't think I've had any book with so much research. I had to buy new furniture just to keep the files because it was just growing exponentially. Almost every day there'd be something new, and it was very hard to keep up with. So that kept me pretty busy. And since I finished it a few months ago, I've just been taking the summer off and relaxing.
Gosh, I can understand that. Tell us a little bit about your research process then, because as you said, this is a massive case and there is so much that had to have gone into this. Where do you even start?
It's labyrinthine, really. There's so many different strands. Basically, I started by going down to Hampton, took myself down for the best part of a month to Hampton in South Carolina, to the Low Country, to try and get a feel for the place and meet as many people that knew the Murdaughs as I could. And it was a very educational visit. You know, it took a lot of time to get to know the people. A lot of people that was getting so much publicity by that time after the murders of Maggie and Paul that were people with a close ranks for the Murdaughs. So it took a lot of talking and socializing, getting to know the various people to get the interviews I was looking for.
My next question was going to be, how open were those residents in Hampton County to talking about the Murdaugh? It's a small community, is it not?
Very small. Everybody knows everybody else. The Murdaughs, through Alex, his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, have ruled the Low Country and the 5 counties as solicitors and power brokers for about 110 years. So they know everybody. And there was a certain amount of fear about talking about the Murdaughs. People were very closed up. They were worried that they didn't want anything to come out in print against them. But as things went on, they relaxed and became more open. But there was a protective shield for the Murdaughs, and they liked them. They were genuinely, I think the Murdaughs helped a lot of people. When somebody had a fire or something, they would give some money to rebuild. Somebody had an illness, they would pay hospital fees. So there was a lot of goodwill generated for the Murdaughs too.
That surprises me on some level because the characterizations of the Murdaughs seemed so dark, or maybe now in retrospect. You actually found there were positive perceptions of the family when you were talking to people and trying to draw them out.
Oh, absolutely. There were two. There was the public Murdaughs and maybe you could say the private side. People saw the public Murdaughs who were backslapping, they shake your hand. Alex Murdaugh, for instance, knew everybody by name, and he'd walk past them in a street and he'd say hi, ask about their family. He was a genuinely gifted politician, and he engendered a lot of goodwill because of this. So I think people felt protective against for the Murdaughs, which I think, as you said, Bill, would surprise a lot of people, but that was something I found, definitely.
What did you have to do to get people to open up to you? Did you have to socialize a lot, or was it enough to say, hello, I'm an author and I'm interested in writing about this case? What did you need to do to get people to open up to you?
I just had to tell them where I was coming from. I'd written these books before. Sometimes I would give people books of mine that's been published just so they could get a feel for what I was doing and where I was at. I have a total respect for everybody I interview. They told me something off the record, I wouldn't use it. Also, there are a lot of people in this book that I can't name because it would be dangerous for them, for their livelihoods or something. So I had to give them pseudonyms, but that was to protect them. But I think once people got to know me and feel comfortable with me, they would open up.
Does the fact that your accent stands out anywhere you go in the United States? Here you are, I have Sting's An Englishman in New York in my head as I say this. So it's obvious you're not from around here. As you travel around, does that work to your benefit because you're seen as exotic, or does it make you stand out because you're clearly not from the Low Country?
Funny you should mention Sting's Englishman in New York, because I actually knew Quentin Crisp and spent time with him when I first came to New York 40 years ago. And that's who the song's about. But as far as my accent's concerned, it depends where you are. Sometimes it'll work for me and sometimes it won't work for me at all. You can never really tell. And I think the longer I've been here, the more Brits are coming to America. It's not such an unusual accent as it was when I first arrived 40 years ago. But it can play to your advantage and it can also play to your disadvantage. So it's a toss-up.
What would you say are some of the most surprising things that you learned about the Murdaugh family and their history in Hampton County as you were going through this research process?
Yeah, I think how they operated as a family and as the family law firm, PMPED, which Alex's great-grandfather founded in 1910. They basically had Hampton, and they had 5 counties. It's the biggest kind of Low Countries, the biggest constituency, legal constituency in South Carolina. And the Murdaughs controlled it. They also controlled the juries. When you had civil act plaintiff actions, there was a shopping venue thing in South Carolina. So it didn't matter where you had the accident, it could be some other state, as long as the company you were suing had a presence in Hampton or the 4 other counties, they could be sued there. So that's why all these hugely big lawsuits came to Hampton. And that's why they were good to the people in Hampton, because the Hampton jurors were synonymous with giving huge cash payouts, bigger than anywhere else. And that's one of the most interesting things I discovered, in fact. The railroad, CSX, runs directly through South Carolina and through Hampton. So anytime there was a train accident or something, it would come to a Hampton jury. The interesting thing about that is Alex's great-grandfather, Randolph Sr., actually was killed by a train by the same company in another incarnation in 1920. He was coming back from a very drunken poker night, and nobody really knows if it was just because he was drunk or he was trying to commit suicide because his wife had just died. He drove at the tracks as the train was coming and just waited there, actually waved to the signalman, said as it plowed into him, and killed him completely. I think he was thrown 120 yards away. And in fact, his son, Buster, actually sued the train company, and from then on, they made millions, the Murdaughs, suing this train company forever for the next 100 years. So that's how that started. I found that very interesting, yeah.
That sounds like a suicide more than an accident, wouldn't you say?
I thought so. Nobody wanted to speculate. To me, I thought it was a suicide. One of my best interviews was with a very close Murdaugh friend called Sam Cruz III, who his father and grandfather have been entwined with the Murdaughs for over 100 years. He opened up to me in his house. I went to his house and spent a couple of hours there on a Saturday morning. He was very generous, and he told me a lot of things I never knew about the Murdaughs before. I think new things that nobody else will ever hear about until the book comes out. He wouldn't commit whether it was suicide or drunkenness, but I think it was suicide.
You were talking about these massive sums of money awarded by Hampton County juries, and that really struck me too as I was reading, just the huge payouts. When all of the reporting was being done on the Murdaugh family, it had come out that Alec was shafting people for this huge amount of money. I had no idea the extent of it. I was reading your book, and at times as I'm coming across these figures, my jaw is dropping, going, I can't believe he embezzled that much money from that many people. I was really just astounded by that. I had no idea the scope of it. Was that a surprise to you when you started doing this much research?
Yeah, I didn't realize that you could. He basically stole nearly $10 million from his clients. These are people that were horribly injured or died in car crashes. He befriended them. A lot of them grew up with Alex. Some of the people he ripped off actually went to school with Alex and knew him and trusted him. He was president of the South Carolina Association of Justice for 3 or 4 years. He was the lawyer in South Carolina for plaintiffs. People trusted him, and he just ripped them off for millions. And he would look them in their face and smile and take their money, which was, that came out at trial. He unabashedly admitted it. He finally admitted it, that he did this. I personally think he's a sociopath. He has no empathy with anybody, and he would look you in the eye and steal the clothes off your back. I didn't know somebody that could exist and be so well respected for so many years before his downfall.
It sounds like there's almost two Murdaughs. There's this public-facing, friendly, as you said, backslapping guy who is well-known and respected in the community. And then with the other side of him, he's reaching around and stealing tens of millions of dollars from his clients, many of whom needed that money as a result of accidents, injuries, or deaths.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
There are. Maybe he's a schizophrenic. There are definitely two sides. And his family also saw the same side. He actually stole $120,000 from his own brother, Randy. Can you believe that? From his own brother, he stole it. I think his family really loved him and believed in him. Maybe there's a really dark side deep inside Alex Murdaugh that nobody ever saw, that never came out until all these things were exposed. But he must be a very deeply troubled man to be able to live with these two sides going on. Obviously, he compartmentalizes a lot to do it. I've tried to get into a lot of people's minds for these books, but with Alex Murdaugh, it was really impossible, I think. Maybe there's a new medical term for it, but I haven't found it.
There's another person in this book who also has two sides to his personality, of course, and that is Paul, who turns into Timmy whenever he drinks alcohol. That part of it was shocking to me as well. How large a role does the abuse of or addiction to alcohol and drugs play in the Murdaugh's downfall, do you think?
Oh, hugely, absolutely. For a start, Alex Murdaugh admits that he was heavily addicted to opioids, and would spend thousands of dollars every week on it. And he's also been charged with manufacturing and distributing through a cousin of his, Curtis Smith, who's very involved in the whole story. If you've got somebody on opioids all the time, that's got to do something to their head. And the whole Murdaugh family was based on alcohol. Basically, his grandfather was pretty much a bootlegger. This is Buster Murdaugh. He was arrested and stood trial for being involved in bootlegging operations in the 50s, but got away with it and resumed his job as a solicitor. Paul Murdaugh, the younger son of Alex and Maggie, and his brother Buster, they were both brought up with alcohol. It was like a part of the family. There was always a cooler of cold beers when they went hunting, and the kids had free access to it. And I understand from friends that Maggie would proudly joke about how her little innocent sons were drinking. She thought it was fun. So they were brought up in this kind of childhood of alcohol. And I think Paul became an alcoholic at a very young age. He'd drink every day. He'd get out of control. And his friends gave him the nickname Timmy because when he got drunk, his fingers would stretch out and remain like that. His eyes would get huge and he'd just be wandering around like a separate person. It was like a Jekyll and Hyde thing. And he'd scare people when he became Timmy. And his friends would say, Timmy is out. And basically, that was the downfall of the Murdaughs when Timmy came out on this boat trip to the Oyster Fest and crashed the boat and killed Mallory Beach. And that's when everything started, the dominoes started falling with the Murdaugh family.
Just recently announced a few days ago that there's been a very large settlement in that boat crash. And it's taken this long for them to get to a place where they arrived at a settlement.
5 years, I think. What I understand is it's a $18 million global settlement. It hasn't been announced exactly where the money is going to who, but I think the beach, Mallory's parents are going to get a huge amount of it, and also Connor Cook, his cousin Anthony, who were on the boat.
Miley Altman, I think she was also on the boat, was she not?
Who's his girlfriend?
Yeah, I think it was Miley.
No, the other one.
Oh, Morgan.
Morgan, yeah.
Morgan, yeah.
So it hasn't been announced exactly who's getting what yet, but it seems to be like the civil part of it is over, because it was supposed to go to trial in August with Alex Murdaugh probably testifying. So now that's not going to happen.
There are so many twists and turns to this story. And one thing I really appreciated about the book is we finally have a timeline, because when I remember becoming aware of the Murdaugh case, it started with Alec being shot in the head on the side of the road. And then bits and pieces of the story started coming out from there. It became really hard to follow. So I appreciated the fact that this book really sets the record straight. Here's what happened first, then second, then third, then fourth. It really smoothed things out for me. Was it difficult to untangle all of the things that had happened and put them in a linear order?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it was a real job. In all my books, I do a timeline, a single-space timeline of everything. And this ran to 250 pages. It was a huge timeline, because that's the only way you can make sense of it. And I find when you do a timeline, certain things that you don't think are related, when you put them in a timeline, that they are. And that's how I do my books. So I think for the first time, the reader will get a clear and concise look at the Murdaugh history, which up to now has been in bits and babs and tangled, like the book Tangled Vines, the story. I think I've hopefully untangled it and made it clear to follow from beginning to end.
This story has been so twisted, and of course their family history is bizarre. This timeline, I think, is going to serve a very valuable function for people understanding how the Murdaughs built this fantastic dynasty, but ultimately it collapses under its own weight.
Yeah, and I think there's no way to understand what happened unless you go back to the Murdaugh history, how they came to Hampton. Great-grandfather, Randolph Sr., started the law business and then became the first solicitor of the 5 counties of the Low Country, and how the family tradition went from there. I think that is all part of it, and a very important part of understanding exactly what motivated Alex to do what he did and the horrific murders that he's been found guilty of. I think it all comes down to the legacy he perceived as a Murdaugh being very special and different than anywhere else. The only comparison I can make is, as Sam Cruz III told me, it's like the Kennedys, but without the publicity and outward glamour. But there was the Kennedy part of it with the children and everything that reigned through the Low Country.
Okay, so English teacher question. Once you've got your 250-page timeline, how long does it take you to flesh out the book after that? Because I imagine the timeline and getting it all placed in a linear fashion probably takes a while. How long does it take after that to do the rest of the process?
I'm doing about 3 months on the timeline, but I've also got a lot of interviews. I've done 36 interviews. I have to transcribe them and everything. I'm doing my research and printing everything out. So once I got that, I think I was probably near around 3.5 months actually writing. Yeah, probably 3.5 months writing it. Then it has to go to my editors at St. Martin's with their input and make changes there from the first draft. So it's a very long process until you get into the galleys, which you have there.
Most people allow themselves to be recorded for your interviews, John, because obviously there's a tremendous amount of detail that you want, and yet you mentioned fear on the part of some of these people. How do you balance that? Will they let you record?
Oh, yes, I have to tell them I'm recording first of all, but they're pretty open about that. And if there's something they didn't want said, they say, turn off the recorder. So I'd let them do the off the record bit and then turn it back on.
One thing that I was particularly interested in the book is that Alec had a number of co-conspirators in this money laundering operation that he was doing, which I hadn't heard anything about in the reporting. Can you talk to us a little bit about his buds who helped him out with this money laundering?
There was a lawyer that he was at law school with, South Carolina School of Law, Corey Fleming. They were very close. They were very close friends. And in fact, Corey was in Alex's wedding to Maggie. He was also, I think, Paul's godfather. And when a lot of these cases came up, the plaintiff cases, especially the Gloria Satterfield, Alex would use Corey as the main person to do the cases without telling the people how close he was, that was the lawyer. So Corey, in fact, was charged with a number of crimes.
So does that mean that Corey and Alex weren't necessarily as public about their close friendship and alliance?
They wouldn't reveal it at all. Nobody knew. They just said, Alex would just say, this is a great experienced lawyer, without saying they were the roommates at college and he was the godfather of his son. The other one was Russell Lafitte, who in fact was president of the Hampton Bank, very close to Alex. In fact, Alex dated his then, before his wife, Susie, in school, in the Wade Hampton School. They dated, they're in the yearbook. They were both very close. Russell Lafitte would just give him really generous loans from the bank, which were paid back late and whatever. And he has actually gone to trial and been found guilty and is about to be sentenced. But really, I think the whole of Hampton, I was always told there were a lot of other heads that were going to fall in different areas, maybe legal and police that were aiding and abetting the Murdaughs over the years, because it was just an old boys club.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
And one of the things about the Murdaughs, all generations of them, was they knew how to entertain on a lavish scale. And they'd have these kind of hunting parties. They'd invite the main police chiefs of the different areas, the judges, people like that, and they socialized with them so they could call in favors, basically. And that's how, that low country worked. And it worked very successfully for well over 100 years. When Alex fell, everybody's saying this is the end of that. Things are going to have to change for the better.
Just out of curiosity, because I was looking for it in the book and I don't think I ever found it, do we have a running total on how much money Alec actually laundered from all of his clients?
I think there is. I think it was near around 10 million, something like that. With all the different, there was when it came to trial, there was, I think, 99 or so civil actions against him, federal actions, and the South Carolina Attorney General actions. He's got a lot of court cases pending. And even after he was found guilty of murdering Paul and Maggie, I think 25 more federal actions came out. So he's facing, I don't know how many years of trials going forward on this. It was hard to keep a running total because every time I did, he'd get charged with more crimes. He'd get indicted. So it was an ongoing thing, which after I finished the book continues to this day.
It's absolutely crazy. Now, as we'd mentioned off air, what Bill and I have are the advanced reader copies, which don't talk about the trial, but the trial is included in the version of the book that is releasing in August, correct?
The copies you've got were printed before the trial, but I covered the trial. I recorded most of it, took careful notes. So I've added like 2 or 3 chapters on the end of the book, which really makes it complete, covering the whole trial. And the dramatics of it were just quite amazing. Nobody dreamed that Alex Murdaugh would actually take the stand in his own defense. In fact, his lawyers did not want him to, but against their wishes, he was so arrogant, so much hubris, that he actually took the stand for almost 2 days. I think he thought he could persuade the jury, he could look them in the eyes like he did in so many plaintiff cases successfully and sway them over to finding him not guilty. But that didn't work.
What was your perception sitting there watching him testify? Was the inner monologue in your head saying, I can't believe he's doing this? Or what were you thinking?
Yeah, I couldn't believe it. I just thought this is the worst possible thing he could have done. I think up to that point, many people, including myself, thought that it might be a hung jury because this was in Colleton County Court where the Murdaughs practiced. Alex did cases. In fact, the interesting thing is that his own grandfather, Buster Murdaugh, had his portrait at the back of the court, and the judge ordered it taken down before the trial started because it would have been unfair to the state. So I watched Alex, and I just thought, he's damning himself, because it could have been a hung jury. All it needed was one juror to find not guilty, and he would have gone free, or there would have been a retrial. But it was unanimous, and incredibly, in just 3 hours, they came back and found him guilty of all charges.
I was really surprised that nobody filed for a change of venue. Was that ever even a possibility, or were they just going to try it right there in the same place where his grandfather's portrait was?
I thought there might be a change of venue, but I think Alex Murdaugh wanted it tried there because he thought he might get the equivalent of a Hampton jury, because Colleton County is right next door. He thought they'd be sympathetic. But anyway, they decided to go with Colleton County, and obviously for justice, a good decision.
This track record that he had and his law firm had to win these massive judgments, do you think money may have changed hands after the fact with key jurors in some of those cases? If he's stealing money all over the place, he's not going to stop necessarily at the ethical boundary. Oh, I couldn't possibly bribe members of the jury, or after the fact.
Yeah, I can't speak for some of the other cases, but I do know from a librarian I spoke to, interviewed, her husband was in fact sitting on a jury, and it was a very interesting, I think, early 90s case where Muhammad Ali's doctor. Muhammad Ali was suffering from cancer, and he had this doctor he totally believed in, and the doctor was getting sued as a quack, basically, Hampton County Court for about $20 million. The trial went on with the jury. Muhammad Ali was actually called. He came and testified in Hampton County at one of the days of trial. But I interviewed the librarian's husband. He was serving on the jury, and he basically said that it was going on past the money they would pay per diem rate to the jurors, so they weren't going to get paid because they weren't getting paid by their jobs. Alex Murdaugh, he said, his company were very generous with the jurors. They kept paying them money even when they wouldn't have got paid.
Wow.
Or declared a mistrial. So I won't say there were huge amounts of money being paid. But another interesting thing is that I heard that Alex's father, Randy Murdaugh, would often boast and say, oh, we had to pay off a few jurors today. Very tongue-in-cheek, and nobody knows whether he was serious or not. So it's a closely guarded secret whether they were doing anything nefarious like that.
Unbelievable. Can you go back over, and again, you weren't able to get into this in the advanced reader copies that we have, but I know it's in the upcoming release book. Can you go over the evidence that eventually led investigators to conclude that Alec did, in fact, murder Maggie and Paul? Like, what was the smoking gun in this case, if I can be so glib to say that?
Yeah, right after the night Maggie and Paul were murdered right by the dog kennels, Alex Murdaugh's story was that, in fact, his son and wife had gone to the dog kennels, I think, after dinner around 6 o'clock. He'd had a nap. He'd been watching TV. He hadn't seen them until the murders, which I think were around close to 10 o'clock that night. He hadn't seen them at all. He'd gone to visit his ailing mother, who was very sick with Alzheimer's, and then come back to discover them dead. Amazingly enough, when they took all the evidence, they took Paul's iPhone, and they couldn't break it down. They couldn't get into his password for more than a year, I think. The state police SLED tried, FBI, and eventually it took a year to get into his iPhone, which it came out at trial was something to do with his birthday, which baffles me why it would have taken so long. But more than a year later, they got into it, and they discovered a Snapchat video that Paul had taken minutes before his murder when he was in the kennels, and he was sending it to one of his good friends. Paul was looking after his dog that was sick, and he was taking videos of the dog, telling his friend how it was doing. And in the video, you can distinctly hear Alex's voice saying something like Bubba, which was the dog had come in with a chicken and going Bubba. And there's one line where you can hear Alex's voice saying that, which proved he was actually in the kennels with Maggie and Paul literally 2 or 3 minutes before the actual murder. Now, this came out very dramatically at trial. Nobody had an idea about this before. And this was the smoking gun. Witness after witness that knew Alex Murdaugh for years, friends, they replayed this tape, which was like a 30-second tape. It was pretty short, with Alex's voice. They all testified that was Alex's voice. He had no leg to stand on. When he came up in the witness stand, he had changed his story to try and make allowances for this. But I don't think the jury would have bought it. And one of the most dramatic things was at the summing up, the prosecutor, Creighton Waters, said actually that was Paul speaking from the grave. Because Paul was called as the little detective, because right before the murder, it was shown that Paul was looking into Alex's case and finding all his opioids, and the mother had found it, and they were doing checks on Alex's drug use, and Maggie called him the little detective. So at closing, Creighton Waters, I think, said, "This is the little detective from the grave exposing what his father did." That was, to me, was so dramatic and intense. And if there was a smoking gun, that was it. And without that Paul's few-second tape with Alex's voice on, I'm sure he wouldn't be in jail right now for murder. I think he would have walked free.
That one bit of recording with Alex's voice in the background took all the air out of his false story that he was visiting his mother, which would have taken him elsewhere and substantially a number of miles away from the location where the murders took place at the Hunt Club. He's committed the murders, and then he got in his car to visit his mother, driving these thin rural country roads, which I know, I drove them. They scared the hell out of me when I was in Hampton. And he drove to his mother's house at speeds reaching up to 80 miles an hour. The caregiver, testified that Alex came there and he was holding something. She didn't know what it was. And he sat with his mother on the bed for a few minutes. Then he got up and left, drove back. And that's when he drove straight to the kennels and dialed 911 and called the police. That tape from Paul's iPhone, I think, just destroyed his whole alibi. And I felt sorry almost for the defense, because there wasn't much they could do.
What, if anything, is happening with regard to the deaths of Stephen Smith and Gloria Satterfield? Are you aware of anything new that's happening there?
Well, the Gloria Satterfield, this is the Murdaugh housekeeper that supposedly I think it was 2015. Oh, no, I think it was 2019. Had gone up to Moselle, tripped down the stairs and suffered a fatal head injury. And Alex took responsibility, saying the dogs had tripped her, and then managed to get $4 or $5 million payout to her sons, which never went to them, went to Alex's bank account. When this all came out, her body was exhumed, and we still haven't heard still haven't heard autopsy results. That's still pending. But with Stephen Smith, that has been, since the trial, there was a lot of, Stephen Smith was actually in Wade Hampton class with Buster Murdaugh. They were in the same class, and there was a lot of rumors, unsubstantiated, that Stephen, who was openly gay, had some kind of relationship with Buster. In 2015, he was mysteriously found in the middle of the road, run over, supposedly. Even the highway patrol police were convinced it was murder, but it was supposedly hushed up through the Murdaughs. That's been reopened again, and I understand there's a grand jury right now convening on what action they're going to take and if anyone's going to be charged in it. So that's an open case, as is Gloria Satterfield, yeah.
It's fascinating. So there's a strong possibility that there may be further developments in both the Stephen Smith and Gloria Satterfield cases.
I would bet on it, yes. Whether it's Buster Murdaugh or not, I do not know. There's other names that have been levied about that one.
Yeah, I was about to ask, what do you think the chances are that Buster Murdaugh comes out of this completely unscathed?
I have no idea. To be honest, watching the trial, I felt sorry for Buster. He lost his mother and his younger brother, and his father's been convicted of their murder. You hear some of these phone calls. One of the things in the book, I got access through another reporter, filed a Freedom of Information request for Alex's jailhouse calls when he was first arrested. And I got access to more than 200 of them, which I painstakingly went through. And there's a lot of conversations between him and Buster, who you can see he's manipulating the whole time. One of the most amazing things I found, you asked me earlier, what did you find in the book, was that behind bars, I think for the second anniversary of Paul's death, Buster organized a birthday party for all Paul's friends in Charleston at a bar through their lawyer and young Buster. This was Alex organizing this party on Paul's birthday. He also, whenever it came up to Mother's Day or something like that, he would urge Buster to put flowers on Maggie and Paul's grave and keep reminding them and everything. He was a master manipulator. But you can hear in his calls how fraught Buster sounds as things progress. More and more comes out. So who knows what the real relationship is. But Buster is a Murdaugh, and I'm sure he feels like a family closing ranks, even if he believes that his father is guilty of the murders he's been found guilty of.
And there's a possibility, as has been mentioned elsewhere, that Buster and perhaps some of his friends may be involved in the murder of Stephen Smith.
I'm saying that was basically rumors. I interviewed Stephen's twin sister Stephanie and her mother Sandy. I went to a fundraiser. That's when I came to met with them. And Stephanie says that Stephen confided that he was having a fling with some very high-powered young man in Hampton, which she assumed was Buster. There was also talk right after Stephen Smith was found dead. The rumor mill went into overdrive that somehow Buster was involved. To be honest, to Buster, this has never been substantiated, and it remains rumors at the moment, and I wouldn't want to bet how that will turn out.
It looked at the end of the book that Buster is not planning on following in his father's footsteps, because there was a portion of a phone call where Alec was encouraging him to go back to law school, and Buster was hemming and hawing on that. Is he going to be, I would say, the Murdaugh to break the cycle, do you think?
I reckon so. Buster was expelled from South Carolina Law School, where Alex, his grandfather Randy, great-grandfather Buster, and great-great-grandfather Randolph Sr., they all went to law school. Buster was rather ignominy expelled for supposedly plagiarism. From the phone calls, you can see that Alex paid some very big wheels in the South Carolina legal profession, about $60,000 to try and get Buster reinstated. And during the phone calls, he's nagging Buster. Have you followed up with the dean? Have you done this? And Buster sounds very disinterested. In the meantime, Buster has, he's got a job for the corporate office. I think it's called Wild Wings. It was a chain franchise food place that he's working for there. And he seems disinterested in the law at the moment. And I can't see with what's happened, he could possibly get back into law school. So I think that's the end of the chain, although maybe other Murdaughs may become lawyers, next generation.
It does sound a lot like the Kennedy family. Now that you've made the comparison, I can't unsee it.
Absolutely, yeah, it totally does.
The whole thing makes me shudder because it sounds like there's been corruption at its highest and lowest level going on there for over 100 years.
Over 100, yes. And they got away with it. The Murdaughs were the law, basically. They were the police. They were everything in those 5 counties, which is a huge area extending to Beaufort. And they really ruled the roost. And they could get away with anything. Interestingly enough, it came out at trial that when Paul crashed the boat, they went to the hospital, and very soon afterwards, Alex Murdaugh and his father Randy turned up to try and control the situation. Alex walked in, and he was an assistant solicitor. He had a gift badge. He pulled out his badge and he put it round his neck when he walked into that hospital to try and get people to shut up. We're lawyering up. They're not saying anything. And he tried to stop any of the four other teenagers talking to any of the police or anything when he tried to put a hold on it. That just shows the corruption there.
You had used the word hubris a while back to describe Alec, and I feel like that really is the best descriptor for him. This feels almost like a Greek tragedy in a way, except I'm glad for the Murdaugh downfall. I'm not going to lie about that. But this definitely has the feeling of you fly too close to the sun and look what happens.
Right. Yeah, it was arrogance and hubris. The generations before Alex, they knew how to work that. They knew how to control the whole area, but they weren't so public about it. They drove normal kind of cars. They didn't flaunt their worth. And I spoke to people that were very close to the Murdaughs, and they say that Alex, this was the first time. Maggie was a social media, nut. She would get on Facebook and she would post pictures of them all in their private planes, flying off to these various venues, hunting and fishing, and just putting in everybody's face. And I think if they kept a lower profile like their ancestors, this might never have happened. Right too close to the sun.
It feels like, the sins of the father. And then the story you mentioned about Maggie, the mother, being so amused by Paul and Buster's drinking and hijinks when they were teenagers, ultimately that also led to their downfall, because the whole boat crash and the appearance of Timmy, the alter ego, it's all there. And these are all patterns and self-destructive behaviors that started back when they were still under the control of their parents.
Absolutely. And I think it started even further back than that. I go into Alex's childhood, and especially when he was at the University of South Carolina, he got into a lot of hijinks, drunken fights at strip clubs with his friends and brawls and whatever. And they were always swept under the carpet. As soon as they realized he was the solicitor's son, they would drive him home and no questions asked. So it goes back generations. But Alex really took it to the next stage with being so public about it and flaunting his wealth.
It's an absolutely amazing book. John, I know you said you were taking the summer off. What is next in terms of projects?
I'm being a little close-lipped about this at the moment, but there's a few things I'm looking into at the moment,
Fantastic. We definitely want to have you back whenever you've got another book ready for publication.
The book is Tangled Vines. It comes out August 8th with author John Glatt.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure as always.
John, we really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.